why should I get to vote? Yeah, so this was not a clickbait title. I genuinely want to ask the question, why should I, as someone who makes $60,000 a year with no other outstanding debts, get to vote? More specifically, the point I'm trying to get at is, to what extent do I need representation within Congress as someone who is largely a beneficiary of society as it currently stands? And of course, what better place to go to answer this question than Quora, which is a site where it's kind of like Reddit, where basically you can ask a question and anyone can respond. I think the idea of Quora is that it's more oriented around questions and answers, and in your response, you can say why you're qualified to answer said question. When I was looking for this general question within Quora, the question being basically, why should rich people have the right to vote? I found its corollary, should only poor people be allowed to vote? And I think there were some very interesting answers that came through, and I want to pick out 5 of them to explore how I think they underline how we think about voting. Now, this first response comes from someone who actually misread the prompt. As far as I can tell, it seems that they thought the prompt was asking, should poor people not be allowed to vote? Which in some sense is probably the more common question that you would come across. In general, the thinking being that poor people tend to be associated with a lack of education, and therefore a lack of education would somehow deem someone a lower quality voter. And so they're responding why they think poor people should be allowed to vote. And for this reason, they bring up some good points, specifically that in voting, you are voting for representation for yourself. And as lower income people in a society, that typically is also associated with less power influence. It is incumbent upon a society that seeks egalitarianism to have representation for people that have less power and influence in that society. And in our predominantly capitalist societies, that means lower income individuals. This responder makes the points that the government is uniquely situated as representatives of the people with their financial capability and outreach and accountability to be able to, I guess, enact justice and to help and benefit poor people. Now, this next point that the person makes, they get into trying to address the counter argument to why poor people shouldn't be allowed to vote. The reason that some people think that poor people shouldn't be allowed to vote, and in a sense, this responder seems to justify their thinking in this way, is, as I mentioned up top, the association of a lack of education, illiteracy, and how this could lead to an increase in the takeover of government and society more generally by evil tyrants. I guess the argument is that a lack of education would lead to lower critical thinking and therefore an increase in the likelihood that they could be influenced by manipulative power seekers. In addressing this argument, they do state as a fact that poor people have a greater tendency to associate with sectional identities. So like regional identities or religious identities. I don't know that that's actually true, that poor people have any greater association with sectional identities than do rich people. They don't provide any evidence for this. So I call that into question. But generally, I think their response is good because they're defending the right of poor people to be able to vote. A good point that they make is their very last line, which is that denying their due rights bodes ill not only for them, but even for the society that harbors them. And yeah, I'm going to call it a foreshadowing of this way in which we think about voting. But let's go into the second response, or the second responder, the second responder's response. And from here, we're basically, so all these people, they did not misread the question. So they are responding to the question, should only poor people be allowed to vote? And I think that the sentiment that's going to come up here in all these responses is a sense of hostility. And we'll see this repeatedly throughout these next 4 responses. So they specifically say, Quote, I don't know about you, but when it seems that I'm only making money so that some government can steal it from me at the behest of a population too dumb to understand the consequences of their actions, parentheses, studies do back this up, close parentheses, I'm more likely to move to another country or location. This is something that we will see returned to many times and is something I'm going to refer to as the Randian assumption, which is that as a society moves towards more of what we would think of as a welfare state, trying to, in a sense, balance out the inequities between higher income and lower income individuals, that the higher income individuals who are believed to be the smarter, more talented, as Ayn Rand would put, the movers of the world, the shakers of the world, these individuals will leave that society because I guess they don't believe that they're getting valued for their contributions. First off, I would ask, is this true? Will they actually leave? And if they do leave, is this bad? And I think we could look at this from a historical perspective in the white flight of the 50s and 60s, which it's not a one-for-one because we're talking about higher income individuals, which in today's society wouldn't exclusively be white individuals. And the white flight of the 50s and 60s probably had more to do with racism than a flight of higher income individuals from a society would today. Not that there wouldn't be a racist component to it, but anyways, in regards to the question, is this bad? I think you can look at the white flight of the 50s and 60s and see how that was detrimental to the communities, specifically like the cities, as the white people who held most of the wealth moved and basically took their resources out of the city and into the developing suburbs. And that kind of left this removal of value. And I mean value here in the sense of like this removal of material value, not moral value from the cities. But to get back to the previous assumption before that, that this Randian assumption, as I'm calling it, or just generally capital flight, which is what someone else will call it, is that inevitably the case in a society that seeks egalitarianism? I'm not saying that it won't happen, but other than the historical phenomena of white flight, I don't know that there's evidence in my knowledge that we can point to of this happening. And again, I think white flight had more of a racist component to it than necessarily a material economic component to it, which isn't to say that the two aren't linked. So that was the second responder. As I mentioned up top, in Quora, you can put what qualifications you have to be able to respond to the question. From here, I'm just going to refer to the people by what qualifications they say they have. So this next person describes themselves as a self-professed lawyer in 5 countries. So the lawyer also takes on a hostile tone, and they also are convinced of the inevitability of what they call capital flight, or as I mentioned previously, the Randian assumption. I do think this response is interesting because they break down, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but this question was posed 8 years ago. So we're talking pre-COVID, we're talking like in the midst of the first Trump presidency. And so the numbers that this person is using might be different than what they would be today, but I think it gives us a general picture of how we could look at this question. But this lawyer wants us to consider, what do we mean when we say poor people? If we define poor people by the federal poverty limit, then if only poor people are allowed to vote, this is going to reduce the voting size to about 16% of what it is today. Or if we define poor people by the 25th percentile of median income, then by definition, this will decrease the voting population to about 25% of what it is today. And what I would be arguing for here is more of a definition of quote unquote poor. Again, my outset at this was not to say, should only poor people be allowed to vote? I was more looking at what point should a certain income level, should you no longer need the representation that voting affords? But regardless, if I were to kind of adapt that into this person's schema here, I would be looking at more like defining a poor person as someone at the median income, basically. So if you are at or below the median income, then you would be able to vote. If you're above the median income, then you would not be able to vote. I also want to preface here that there's a lot of like logistical questions that can be asked that are not of interest to me. Like exactly what number or how would it work in this case, or how would you measure it for families? Those are all valid questions, but they're not my primary interest here. I'm getting at it from a broader perspective of how we think about voting. The reason I'm pointing out this person's schema of how we define poor people is because it does bring up the interesting point. Like at what level generally would we say that someone is no longer eligible to vote, and what effect would that have? Now, basically, this person's response is that as you go from the federal poverty limit to the 25th percentile, you would see basically slowly a decrease in the level of welfare statism that is produced, i.e. that if only someone at the federal poverty level is able to vote, then there's going to be a much higher tendency for welfare state policies to be enacted. And I use welfare state in like quotations here, meaning that like what we would generally think of with a welfare state, not necessarily bringing in the moral baggage with all that. Again, this person talks about the issue of how lower income individuals are generally associated with a lack of education, and how, in their words, this responder's words, this lawyer's words, it would produce entirely unpredictable consequences, which we get our first piece of external evidence here in a response by linking to a Psychology Today article about the movie Idiocracy, which is interesting in and of itself, and which I'll get into now. It's written by a psychology professor. I think it's a doctorate of psychology. I guess their premise is that the movie, the 2006 movie Idiocracy, is not just a prophecy of where America could end up, but is actually already happening. I think this article was written in 2012. So again, this Quora question, we're looking at like 2017, 2018, whereas I think the Psychology Today article was written in 2012. So we're looking at the beginning of the second Obama term, an incredibly different time politically than in the middle of the first Trump term. So from the outset, the author approaches the article with a sense that, of course, they're not talking to us, the reader, or they're not talking about themselves as being idiots because, you know, of course, we're the learned people, but they do point to this rise in idiocy. His definition seems to be a rise in the rate of illiteracy, a rise in the rate of obesity, and a rise in the rate of religiosity. I will let that definition stand on its own. I think that is a critique in and of itself if that is how you are defining idiocy. And I think the more interesting point here is that this guy is coming across as kind of like a liberal in the sense of like a Bill Maher type. Calls himself a liberal, is kind of thought of as the left, especially in this time period. But, you know, by our current standards in political history, would be thought of as at best a centrist, and in many ways has been adopted by the right, like Bill Maher has, like RFK Jr. has. And so in this sense, while they were left of the current right and the conservative right generally, at best there may be centrists because, at least as far as I can tell, they're not overtly homophobic. But these aren't the left with a capital L. And I would say the best evidence for this is in the way that this writer structures his argument, which is more from an individualist perspective, more from what I would consider a right-leaning individualist perspective of society, rather than a more structural understanding of society. That is like how society affects the individuals rather than how individuals affect the society. The big point that he makes is that as he's watching this movie Idiocracy, which is interrupted by the commercials that he's watching on TV, he's noticing how the commercials seem so similar to this society of idiocracy. I didn't explain this, but for those of you who haven't seen Idiocracy, the premise is that at the movie's time, 2006, like average maybe worker wakes up in 100 years or however long America to a society where he is now the most intelligent person because society has quote unquote devolved into this kind of worshiping of shallow values and a lack of education, and the plot plays out from there. But in pointing to the commercials that the author is watching while also watching the movie, he uses that as evidence, saying that these commercials are a reflection of our individual desires. And so the shallowness of the commercials today are evidence of where America is headed. And he doesn't at all address the fact that these commercials could be a reflection of the desires of companies seeking to make a profit. And I'm not saying here that it's either one or the other. I think there is an interplay here. I think the structuralist perspective, it has a more maybe useful critique if we're looking at things sociologically, but regardless, he just doesn't consider that at all. He seems to think that society comes built out of the individual and that the individual isn't impacted by things in society itself, from what he writes here. So that's, to go back to it, that's the evidence that is provided for why a society of only uneducated, quote unquote, voters, by nature of them being poor, would be, as the lawyer puts it, entirely unpredictable. All right, so this next responder on Quora is a self-professed European liberal observer of the world stage. And again, this use of the word liberal here I think is interesting. I spoke about this in a previous video, but liberal is thought of as synonymous with the left, at least from many on the right. And that's because from the right, liberals tend to be more center and left, but that doesn't mean they are the quote unquote left as the left with a capital L would define themselves. So again, this guy's taken on a hostile tone, and this is evidenced through his use of satire. Ironically though, in his satire, he makes the good point that can the rich really know, and he doesn't use these exact words, I'm paraphrasing it, but can the rich really know what it's like to be in a dead-end job making below a living wage? He makes this point jokingly, but I think this is an incredibly valid point, because if I look at my own life, yeah, I don't know what it's like to work a job that has no upward mobility built into it, or at least not really. You know, it has the veneer of an upward mobility that is nominal increases in wages that aren't actually going to ever reach a living wage. And all the while, the people living through this are having to work and possibly raise a family in these conditions and figure out how they're going to make it all work. Yeah, I don't know what that's like. So I think that is, even though he says it ironically, a very good point as to why rich people, in a sense, aren't as knowledgeable as poor people. The other interesting thing he mentions comes from the last paragraph that he writes, which is, so he says, after long debate and trial and error, we have come to universal adult suffrage. Long may it continue. I think this is an interesting point and will further help develop our sense of what voting means to us as a society. But yeah, there's this idea that like it's been settled. We don't need to discuss this anymore. To propose the question that only poor people should be allowed to vote is silly. We're obviously past that, when actually I don't think we've ever discussed this topic. We've discussed the opposite of it. You know, should these previously disenfranchised people, such as Black people or women, get to have the right to vote? But I don't think we've ever really at length discussed the possibility of reducing the power of wealthy individuals through their right to vote. He also mentions universal adult suffrage as if, and again, this was 8 years ago, but I'm sure even then, and especially now, we're seeing how quote unquote universal adult suffrage is a little misleading at a time when the ability of people to vote is becoming more difficult, especially people that are lower income. Yeah, another interesting point. The last responder on Quora, I think this response may be the most interesting of the ones that read the prompt correctly. This person is a self-professed bachelor in theoretical physics, graduated in the year 2020. I'm going to assume that this person is kind of my contemporary. It seems that maybe the other responders were maybe a little older than me, or maybe like a generation or two above me. And this person possibly is of my generation. So I think their response is interesting. They still do hold the premise that rich people are educated. However, as is more recognized in younger generations, I think they recognize that this is a problem, but then they also take on the attitude of, well, what can you really do about it? Because like, that's just kind of how society is. And yes, having only rich people be educated is a problem, but you know, we're working on it. We'll get there someday, kind of thing. And he brings up a interesting analogy, effectively saying that regardless of what an ideal society would look like in terms of education, you don't ask poor people to run a society, just like you don't ask blind people to fly a plane. which I thought was an interesting way of instrumentalizing a blind person. I mean, obviously he's probably referring to the fact that like legally blind people can't obtain a pilot's license or necessarily fly planes independently, but he's wrong that like no one would trust a blind person to fly a plane, because there were two people, one of whom was actually Helen Keller, both of them women who were blind, who flew planes. So the next part of this theoretical physicist's argument rests on the idea that effectively the rich don't vote. And the way he's making his point here is through, one, the fact that rich people, depending on how you define them, make up a much smaller portion of the society and therefore have a lower percentage of the vote than do lower income individuals. But he also does suggest that rich people don't vote in very high numbers, which I couldn't find to be the case. Two sources of which I found were a research paper from the nonprofit group Demos from 2014, which actually shows how voter turnout increases with income brackets. So you have a lower voter turnout proportionally at lower incomes than you do at higher incomes. This is generally referred to as the voter turnout gap, i.e. that higher income individuals vote at a higher rate than lower income individuals do. This difference in voter turnout can be seen not just in the act of voting, but also in the opinions of those who vote. Typically, lower income voters tend to hold more, I'm going to say, progressive opinions about politics, and probably more associated with your typical welfare state, as we were talking about it previously. Now, is this actually the case that if we increased voter turnout among lower income individuals, that this would lead to a more progressive politic? The Demos article research itself says one thing in regards to one thing, and I found another article around the same time that says another thing in regards to another thing. So not that they're necessarily contradictory, but a article in 2012 cites other papers and also shows via its own research that there's little evidence of improved representation of the opinions of Senate voting for lower income communities in those areas where there's a greater level of voter turnout among lower income individuals. So basically saying that even if this voter turnout gap was addressed, it wouldn't actually result in that different of policy outcomes. Contrast this with evidence that Demos provides showing that in states with lower voter turnout gaps, there tends towards a higher minimum wage. So again, these two statements are not in themselves contradictory, and I don't think we can necessarily draw a conclusion as to how politics would progress if we were able to increase the voter turnout among lower income individuals. And part, I think, of the reason that we have this voter turnout gap, and I think something that's addressed in both of these papers, is that among lower income individuals, there's a sense that their vote doesn't actually make a difference. It's more of a vote in namesake and not towards actually any political outcome. So that's why, well, one of the reasons why I bring this argument to the table here is that if in a society where low income individuals are the only ones that have the vote, would that increase the chances of society more moving towards a more egalitarian one, or as I would define, a more just one? And this gets into the sentimentality of voting that I think is the more interesting discussion in all this. And I will now let previous Sam, who forgot to turn on the camera, talk about this in a different t-shirt and in different lighting. So take it away. So taking this research and going back and applying it to the theoretical physicist, their response seems to be that effectively, if we were to enact this policy where only lower income peoples could vote, it wouldn't really make that much of a difference because of lower voter turnout and also the ways in which rich people will inevitably find ways to influence the political system. And even in the other responses where they do acquiesce that, okay, if we did this thing, it wouldn't really change things. But it just seems to be more of based on common sense rather than any sort of actual reasoning as to why this would be. So yeah, I still feel like can stand here and ask the question to you all. What do you think would be the effect if only lower income individuals could vote? What do you think would happen? And obviously, if you have research to cite, please do. I would love to see it. I'm not saying that there's not research. I did a very quick search online, so I know there's more research out there. But the point I want to get into now, which is really the more interesting part to me, is the way in which we sentimentalize voting. I think the more interesting part about all this is that to even ask if we should take away voting rights from certain individuals because they are higher income and because then they would have the higher likelihood to have more influence and power just by nature of the fact that they have more access to power. To ask if we should take away people's quote unquote right to vote seems not like something anyone would ever consider. But again, I'm coming to this stating I think it would be a good idea. This sentimentality of voting, I think, could be best expressed in the response that some people have to voting, which is that people died for your right to vote, which it kind of turns voting into this obligation. I have to go vote because someone else died for my right to vote. Even if true, I don't think that's a good way to make people feel empowered to want to go vote. I think we should make people actually feel empowered to go vote because it can actually make a difference. But I would still say that having more of a voter turnout and possibly even only a voter turnout from poorer people would be a good thing. So, would you give up your right to vote if it meant reaching a more egalitarian society? And in responding to this question, here are some things I want you to think about. Why do we vote? For what purpose do we vote? Is voting an end in itself? Is it a human right to vote, or is it a citizen's right to vote? Or is voting something we use as an end towards a more just society? And obviously it's not either or, but to what extent does it fall towards either of those? And why do we treat voting the way we do? And again, referring to kind of like this obligatory, you should vote because you have the freedom to vote, the sentimentality of it all that I referred to earlier, to where almost like if you're not voting, you're gonna be looked down upon for that. I think you can see this even in like the little stickers, I voted. It's almost like a way to identify that like I did my part as a citizen. And it's interesting that like we have that for voting, but not really any other aspect of the political sphere. I can't think of like any other form of recognition of participating in politics other than like an actual seat in an office somewhere. I don't see people getting recognized for going to like town hall meetings or going to marches for a cause they support. I think that the reward for that is the community that you build, but it doesn't seem like we as a larger society, a larger American society, seem to value those things as much as voting. And I think all this should be centered on the very real fact that if voting is as important as it seems to be in our American consciousness, why is it not a federal holiday? I guess my take on all this is that I think voting is somewhat of a sentimental thing that gets overvalued as an end in itself rather than as a means to a more just society. And honestly, the hostility that I spoke of and that we saw in these responses to taking away some people's right to vote, I think is understandable because we've seen how hard people have fought in the past to gain the right to vote. But I think my argument here is kind of that the well-off, people like me, we've always had a voice in society just by nature of the fact that we have greater access to the political than do poor folk. And it seems like the general project of modern democracy has been to try to limit some of the power of those who are most likely to wield it, the rich. Would having only lower income people vote not be another step in this direction? Now, there are some unanswered questions in all this, which I think are good questions. Obviously, there's the general question of how do we define lower income? That's a little bit more logistical than I want to get into. These are three questions that I thought of that I think would be good questions of how we would still, in this scenario, have a quote unquote just society. The first is, what about non-economic questions? So questions like environmental policy or going to war. I think it is important for all citizens to have a say in those matters. And so if higher income people can't vote, then how do they have their voice heard in that? I think that's a fair point. I think there's a little bit of logistics that could be worked out with that. But yeah, I mean, that is a fair avenue to go down to critique the argument from. This, I think, was the most pressing critique, which is that if you create a divide between those who can and can't vote, would this inevitably lead to a kind of class division? I mean, we already have that class division between higher income people and lower income people. And would this not further exacerbate that? Which I would say is a fair point. However, generally, when we talk about class divisions, we're talking about ways in which those with more power gain more power and those with lower power aren't able to express their own will to power. And in this case, we actually have the opposite, where those with less power generally have more power in this one instance. I don't think having the right to vote is just automatically going to correct the scales, much less like just reverse the scales. I don't propose this question as a solution to all the ills of our society, or even most of them. I think it's an interesting question because I think it gets to how we think about voting and what voting is good for. And if we are just viewing voting as a sentimentality, then to me, it's not really being used towards the end which I think it should be used for, which is to create a just society. The last critique of this argument that I've presented here: would this inadvertently lead to the increase in lobbying power? So if rich people are unable to express or unable to vote, would they then just turn all of their political involvement into lobbying? This is a good point, more than what I'll discuss here. Lobbying in and of itself seems to hold more political influence than does voting. At least that's the general consensus. So I think that is another good question to ask. Would this have the unintended consequence of actually hurting the interest of lower income individuals? And finally, I won't deny that I am a self-professed lefty pharmacist who makes over $60K a year, and that is the perspective from which I am coming to you with this.